Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal. Today is March 4th, and most people who've heard of the Kermit Gosnell case know about the death of 41-year-old Karnamaya Mongar, a Bhutanese refugee who was massively overdosed on anesthesia at Gosnell's clinic. But fewer people know about the first woman to die under Gosnell's care, and that is 22-year-old Shamika Shaw. She died an agonizing death on March 4, 2000 from complications of an abortion performed by Gosnell at his House of Horrors in Philadelphia. On March 29th of 2004, Mark Greenwald, a prosecuting attorney for Pennsylvania's Board of Medicine, filed a one-paragraph prosecution evaluation in a matter referred to the medical board concerning Dr. Gosnell, who for decades had operated a filthy, dangerous abortion clinic in Philadelphia. From the grand jury report. Brief factual summary. The file was opened as a result of a medical malpractice payment report. The underlying malpractice case involved the death of a 22-year-old female following the termination of her fifth pregnancy. Following a seemingly routine procedure on 3/1/02, the patient was taken to the ER at the University of Pennsylvania with complaints of pain and heavy breathing. The patient underwent surgery, but the surgeon was unable to locate any perforation, and the patient died from infection and sepsis. Although the incident is tragic, especially in light of the age of the patient, the risk was inherent in the procedure performed by respondent, and administrative action against the respondent's license is not warranted. Recommendation Z02, prosecution not warranted. Well, that's a pretty scanty description of what happened to Shamika. Shamika Sherelle Shaw, and most of what little we know about her is from her cousin, PA State Representative Margot Davidson. Margot believed that Shamika, whom the family called Mika, sought an abortion because she already had two young children. She and her same-age cousins were the best of friends and were preparing to set up housekeeping together. Shamika underwent her abortion on March 1, 2000, 5 months into her pregnancy. Mika called the facility the next day to say that she was bleeding profusely, but according to court records, she was not instructed to seek care. 2 days later, on March 4th, Mika collapsed on the floor of her family home in the presence of some of her young cousins. One of those cousins later called Margot to tell her that Mika was dead. Margot was bewildered because Mika had been young and healthy. So Margot went to the house to join the grieving relatives and started to hear the story. Mika had been bleeding profusely, writhing and screaming in pain on the floor. The young cousins tried to convince her to go to the hospital. They were afraid to call the clinic because at some point they'd been told not to call if there was a problem. But Mika's continued agony finally overcame their fear, and one of them tried to call Women's Medical Society, but they were unable to reach anybody. Then Mika's mother, Linda, arrived and saw the condition her daughter was in. She took Mika to the hospital, but by then it was too late to save her. Margot was later told that the abortion had been incomplete. Part of the placenta had been left behind, and her young cousin had died from a perforated uterus and sepsis. Margot, in addition to being a state representative, was also a minister, and she did the eulogy at Mika's funeral. The younger cousins were hysterical, trying to pull their friend out of the casket and bring her back to life. Margot didn't even allow them to go to the cemetery because she was afraid they would try to jump into the grave. So, far from that little clinical description, took her to the ER, she had surgery, she died. The thing is, authorities in Pennsylvania already knew about Gosnell. To get an idea of how slovenly the medical board's investigation was, please note that Shamika underwent the fatal abortion in March of 2000. The board didn't even get the year right when reviewing this death before blowing the entire matter off over 4 years after the fact. The grand jury report noted, before Department of State prosecutors decided not to investigate the 22-year-old patient's death, they had been told of Gosnell's many illegal practices. What makes these prosecutors' inaction even more astonishing is that they did know more than the bare facts included in the board attorney's evaluation of the case. On the same day in 2004 that they decided not to do anything about Shamika Shaw's death, these same two prosecutors closed the investigation into a complaint brought to the Department of State more than 2 years earlier by Marcella Stanley Chong. That was the complaint that had alerted the Board of Medicine 8 years before Karnamaya Mangar died to almost all of the violations revealed by this grand jury's investigation. So, little background on that. In December of 2001, Ms. Chong had filed a detailed written complaint about Gosnell to the Department of State, which oversees the medical board. In March of 2002, she testified in a follow-up interview, and as the grand jury report noted, she informed the department investigators that Gosnell was using unlicensed workers, including herself, to give IV anesthesia to patients when he was not at the clinic, that his facility was filthy, that 2 sick, flea-infested cats roamed freely in the procedure rooms, vomiting throughout, that Gosnell ate in the procedure rooms, that the autoclave used to sterilize instruments was broken, that he reused single-use curettes, that there was no licensed nurse at the facility when IV anesthesia was administered, that Gosnell allowed one patient to use her cousin's insurance card to pay for an abortion, that Gosnell performed abortions on underage children against their will if their mothers asked him to, and that he performed other abortions without consent forms. The investigation into Ms. Chung's report consisted of 3 phone calls. Nobody visited the clinic. Nobody interviewed the employees. Nobody contacted the patient who had given Ms. Chong permission to share her contact information with the state. All that came of it was a recommendation, which was never followed up, that the Department of Health should inspect the facility. Now, not that the Department of Health would have done anything. The DOH had first inspected the clinic and given a 12-month license in 1979 in spite of numerous alarming shortcomings. And it didn't review the clinic again until 1989, when it was again permitted to stay open in spite of multiple shortcomings that clearly endangered patients. They repeated this type of review in 1992, again approved the facility in spite of appalling conditions. And in 1993, they reported that the previous deficiencies had been corrected despite continuing deplorable conditions because of a new politically motivated policy not to inspect abortion clinics unless they'd given a complaint. The Department of Health did not enter the clinic again until they were invited to do so by the DEA and Philadelphia DA for the drug raid in 2010. In the 16 years since the new head in the sand policy, they had failed to investigate after receiving at least 6 serious complaints, including 2 reports of patient deaths. Now, Gosnell was able to get away with what he did because of calculated decisions by abortion rights activists to turn a blind eye. I've dubbed this phenomenon the Compton Carr effect after its most straightforward proponent, Janice Compton Carr of the Florida Abortion Council. After the Miami Herald exposed a nasty abortion mill featuring many of the same kinds of deplorable conditions found at Gosnell's clinic, dirty instruments, untrained staff, illegal peddling of narcotics, Compton Carr said, "In my gut, I am completely aghast at what goes on at that place, but I staunchly oppose anything that would correct this situation in law." Now, fortunately, thanks to the internet and crowdsourcing, we bypassed the abortion lobby's cheerleaders in Hollywood and the mainstream media. 2 filmmakers, along with a journalist, raised $2.1 million to produce Gosnell, the Trial of America's Biggest Serial Killer, a movie that very closely follows the original story and takes a lot of dialogue directly from court records and testimony. So, this idea that the abortion lobby is about looking out for women's well-being, that's window dressing. You can look at Dadeland, you can look at Gosnell, you can see this pattern of opposition to anything that would correct this situation in law. It's all about the abortion being legal. When it comes to safe, legal, and rare, they're not even asking for rare anymore, just safe and legal. The safe, that's sprinkles on your cupcake. Legal is the only thing they really care about. They certainly didn't care about Shamika.